My client confessed without hesitation. I pushed her down the stairs. We were 18 minutes into our first session, and I'd been listening to what I thought was a story about a terrible accident. His wife had fallen, multiple fractures, traumatic brain injury. She'd survived, but would never be the same. And he'd been there when it happened, carrying that guilt for 2 years. But then his voice dropped, and he said it again, making sure I heard every word. I didn't try to catch her. I pushed her, and I need you to understand why. Because if I don't tell someone the reason, I'm going to lose my mind trying to justify it to myself. Stick around because what he told me about why he did it, about what his wife had done that, made him choose violence in that split second. It destroyed me. And it's going to change the way you think about marriage, about secrets, and about the things people are capable of when they're pushed too far. Before we go any further, I need to make something clear. All names have been changed, and any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. These are composite stories based on years of clinical experience, designed to protect client confidentiality. What I'm about to share is real in the way that impossible moral choices are real, but the specifics have been altered to protect everyone involved. I've been a licensed therapist for 15 years now. I've worked with over 1,800 clients in that time, and I've learned that the word accident is often the first lie we tell ourselves when we can't face what we've actually done. But this client, let's call him Michael, he wasn't hiding behind that word anymore. He was ready to carry the full weight of the truth, and the truth was crushing him. Michael was 39 when he came to see me, worked in finance in Boston, married for 12 years, 2 kids, 8 and 10 years old. Perfect life on paper. Except 2 years ago, on a Sunday morning, his wife Karen fell down the stairs in their home. 17 steps. She hit the landing at the bottom and didn't get up. Fractured skull, broken ribs, shattered pelvis. 3 weeks in a coma, 6 months of rehabilitation. And when she woke up, she had permanent cognitive damage, memory issues, personality changes. She would never fully recover. Everyone thought it was an accident, Michael said, his hands shaking slightly. The police investigated. There was no evidence of foul play. Karen couldn't remember what happened, and I told everyone I'd been in the kitchen when I heard her fall, that I'd run to help, but it was too late, and everyone believed me. Because why wouldn't they? We were a happy couple. No history of violence, no reason for anyone to think I'd hurt her. If you want to hear how this ends, hit subscribe right now because this gets darker than you can imagine. But you did hurt her, I said carefully. I destroyed her, Michael corrected. And I did it on purpose. And the worst part is, I'd do it again. Even knowing what happened, even seeing what she became. Because of what she told me 60 seconds before I pushed her. Stick around and subscribe, because what Karen told him, what she confessed that made Michael choose violence, it's the kind of secret that makes murder feel like mercy. They'd been arguing that morning. Nothing unusual, Michael said. The kind of married couple argument that happens over logistics and stress. Who was picking up the kids from their activities? Whose turn it was to handle grocery shopping? Small things that feel big when you're exhausted and overwhelmed. And they were standing at the top of the stairs, Karen about to go down, Michael about to go to their bedroom, when she stopped and said something that changed everything. She said, "I need to tell you something. I can't carry it anymore." Michael's voice went flat, emotionless, and I thought she was going to say she wanted a divorce, or that she was unhappy. Something normal, but what she actually said. He paused, closed his eyes. She said, The kids aren't yours, neither of them. I got pregnant with someone else. Both times, and I let you believe they were yours for 10 years. The room went silent. This wasn't a confession about anger or a moment of rage. This was about the complete shattering of someone's entire reality. 10 years of fatherhood, 2 children he'd raised, loved, built his life around, and in one sentence, she'd erased it all. "What did you do?" I asked. "I don't remember deciding," Michael said. One second she was standing there, waiting for me to react, and the next second my hands were on her back and she was falling. I watched her hit every step, watched her body fold wrong, watched her land at the bottom and not move, and I felt nothing. No panic, no regret, just this cold, clear thought. She can't take them from me now. Asterisk, asterisk, here's what I needed Michael to understand. What he'd done wasn't a heat-of-the-moment reaction. It was a calculated attempt to silence truth with violence. Karen's confession threatened everything he'd built his identity around. Being a father, being a husband who'd sacrificed for his family, and in that moment, he'd chosen to erase the threat rather than face it. The push wasn't about rage, it was about control, about making sure she couldn't take away what he believed was his. "Did Karen remember what she told you?" I asked, after she woke up. Michael shook his head. The brain injury took her short-term memory. The doctors said she lost about 3 hours before the fall. Everything from that morning was just gone. She doesn't remember our argument, doesn't remember the confession, doesn't remember anything except waking up in the hospital and me crying. At her bedside, telling her how much I loved her and how scared I'd been of losing her. This is the horror of what Michael created. He'd silenced Karen's confession so completely that she couldn't even remember saying it. The traumatic brain injury had erased her attempt at honesty, and now Michael was the only person who knew the truth. About the kids, about what really happened on those stairs, about everything. "Have you confirmed it?" I asked. "About the children's paternity." "I don't need to," Michael said. "I look at them now and I see it. Things I told myself were just coincidence. My son's eyes, they're not like mine or Karen's. My daughter's temperament, completely different from our family's. I spent 10 years explaining away little things that didn't quite fit. And now I know why they didn't fit. Because they're not mine biologically. They never were. If you're hooked, subscribe, because I have hundreds of these stories, and what Michael told me next about living with this secret makes everything worse. But here's where it gets truly complicated. Michael still loved these children. That hadn't changed. He still got up every morning and made them breakfast, still helped with homework, still coached his son's soccer team, still tucked his daughter in at night. The violence he'd committed against their mother hadn't changed how he felt about them. If anything, it had made him more determined to keep them, to make sure Karen could never take them away or tell them the truth about their paternity. "So you're living a complete lie," I said. "I'm living the only truth that matters," Michael corrected. "Those kids call me Dad. I've been their father for 10 years. Some affair Karen had, some biological fact that doesn't erase a decade of raising them. And if she'd told them, if she'd destroyed that, it would have hurt them more than it hurt me. I pushed her to protect them from that truth. This is the rationalization of someone who's rewritten history to make himself the hero." Michael had convinced himself that the violence was protective, that by permanently damaging Karen's brain, by erasing her memory of the confession, he'd saved his children from the trauma of learning their father wasn't their biological father. But what he'd actually done was ensure they'd grow up with a mother who was permanently disabled, who would never be the same, who would need care for the rest of her life. "How is Karen now?" I asked. "She functions," Michael said carefully. "She can do basic tasks. She knows who we are. But her personality changed. She's quieter, more withdrawn, gets confused easily. The kids have had to adjust to having a mother who's different from the one they remember, and they blame the accident. They have no idea their father is the reason their mother is gone. Would you have done the same thing if your spouse told you your children weren't biologically yours, that your entire family was built on a lie? Would you be capable of violence in that moment? I'm genuinely curious what you think. Let me know in the comments. Before I tell you the worst part, the revelation that made even me question everything. Hit that subscribe button, because what Michael discovered after the fall changes the entire story. 6 months after Karen's fall, after she'd been released from rehabilitation, Michael found something. He was going through old documents for insurance purposes, and he came across Karen's medical records from both pregnancies. Records she'd kept hidden in a locked filing cabinet. And what he found made him realize the truth was even more complicated than he'd thought. There were paternity test results, Michael said, his voice shaking, from 8 years ago, right after our daughter was born. Karen had gotten suspicious about something, and she'd ordered the tests for both kids without telling me. And I asked. "They were mine," Michael said quietly. "Both of them, 100% biologically mine." The tests were conclusive. Karen had known for 8 years that I was their father, and she'd lied to me anyway. She'd told me they weren't mine, knowing it was a lie, and watched me react. And I pushed her for a confession that wasn't even true. The room felt like it was tilting. This wasn't a story about a man protecting his family from devastating truth. This was a story about a woman who'd weaponized a lie so cruel that it caused immediate violence, and a man who'd permanently disabled his wife based on false information. Neither of them were victims. Both of them were monsters in different ways. Why would she lie about that? I asked. "I've thought about it every day for 2 years, Michael said. "And I think she wanted to hurt me. We'd been having problems. Financial stress. I'd been working long hours. She felt neglected. And I think in that moment, she wanted to say the most devastating thing she could think of, to make me feel what she'd been feeling. Abandoned, betrayed, alone. She wanted to hurt me emotionally, and she succeeded. She just didn't account for the fact that I'd hurt her physically. Asterisk, asterisk, here's what made this case so devastating. Michael had spent 2 years believing he'd committed violence to protect a lie, that he'd pushed Karen to prevent her from destroying his family with a truth about paternity. And he'd been living with that weight, that justification, that internal narrative that made him almost sympathetic. A man pushed too far by impossible revelation. But the paternity tests changed everything. Karen had lied, had weaponized the cruelest lie she could imagine. And Michael had reacted with violence to a fiction. Neither of them were innocent. Both of them had tried to destroy the other, and their children were living in the wreckage of that mutual destruction. "Have you told anyone else about the paternity tests?" I asked. "No one. Because if I tell anyone, I have to explain why Karen said what she said. And if I explain that, I have to explain what I did in response. The tests prove the kids are mine, but they also prove I pushed her for a lie. And I don't know which truth is worse. This is the prison Michael built for himself. He couldn't reveal Karen's cruelty without revealing his own. Couldn't explain the lie without explaining the violence. And so he was trapped in a marriage with a woman he'd permanently damaged, raising children who didn't know their mother's disability was their father's fault, carrying the knowledge that the entire catastrophe was built on a lie that lasted exactly 60 seconds before it became irrelevant. Does Karen know about the paternity tests? I asked. She doesn't remember them. The brain injury took those memories too. As far as she knows now, the kids are mine and always have been. She has no memory of ever questioning it. No memory of lying to me. The version of Karen that exists now is innocent of what the old Karen did. And I'm living with a woman who's both my victim and my victim. And she doesn't remember being either. Before I tell you the worst part, the revelation that destroyed even me, hit that subscribe button, because what happened next made me question whether therapy could even help someone like Michael. In our second session, a week later, Michael told me something he'd been holding back, something that made the entire story even darker. Karen's been recovering, he said. Slowly, her memory is coming back in pieces, little fragments. And 2 weeks ago, she said something that made me realize she might be starting to remember what happened before the fall. What did she say? We were having dinner, just normal conversation, and she looked at me and said, "Did I tell you something bad?" Before I fell. "I have this feeling that I said something that hurt you and I can't remember what it was." And I told her no, that we'd just been talking about normal things, that nothing bad had been said, and she believed me. But I saw something in her eyes, some recognition, like part of her brain knows she weaponized something against me and can't access what it was. This is where Michael's carefully constructed protection was starting to crumble. If Karen's memory continued to return, she might remember the lie she told, might remember standing at the top of those stairs and saying the cruelest thing she could think of. And if she remembered that, she might also remember what happened immediately after, might remember hands on her back, might remember the push. And then everything Michael had protected for 2 years would unravel. What will you do if she remembers? I asked. Michael was quiet for a long time. I don't know. Part of me wants her to remember, wants her to know what her lie cost her, wants her to understand that her cruelty had consequences. But another part of me is terrified, because if she remembers, she could go to the police. She could tell our kids what I did. She could destroy everything I've been protecting. And I've thought about whether I'd need to stop her from remembering, whether I'd need to make sure the memories stay buried. What does that mean? I asked, even though I was afraid. I knew. It means I've thought about what would happen if she had another accident, if she fell again, if this time she didn't survive, and how that would solve everything. The kids would grieve, but they'd move on, and I'd be free from the threat of her memory returning. And I hate that I've thought about it, but I can't stop thinking about it. If you were in my position, what would you have said? Would you have broken confidentiality to protect Karen? Would you have tried to convince Michael he was heading toward another act of violence? Or would you have done what I did and tried to help him see the impossible trap he'd created? Comment below, because this is where therapy became something else entirely. What Michael was describing wasn't just guilt or shame. It was the logical progression of violence. He'd pushed Karen once to silence truth, and now he was considering whether he'd need to silence her permanently to prevent truth from resurfacing. The first act of violence had made the second one thinkable, and that's how it works. Violence doesn't satisfy. It metastasizes, creates new problems that seem to require new violence to solve. Michael had started a cycle 2 years ago that he didn't know how to stop. "There's something else," Michael said in our third session. "Something I haven't told you about the paternity tests, about why Karen might have done them in the first place." "What?" "I had an affair," he said quietly. 7 years ago, brief, stupid, with a co-worker. And I thought Karen never found out. But what if she did? What if she knew, and that's why she ordered the paternity tests? To see if I'd gotten someone else pregnant. And when the tests came back, proving the kids were mine, maybe she kept them as insurance, as proof that she could hurt me any time she wanted. And that morning, on the stairs, maybe she was finally using them, finally deploying the weapon she'd been holding for years. This revelation changed everything again. Karen's lie hadn't been random cruelty. It had been strategic revenge. She'd known for years that Michael had cheated, had gotten paternity tests to confirm he hadn't brought a child home from that affair. And then she'd held on to that information, waiting for the right moment to weaponize it. The morning at the top of the stairs, she'd finally decided to burn everything down, to tell him the cruelest lie she could manufacture, to make him feel what she'd felt when she discovered his betrayal. And Michael had responded with violence that silenced her before she could explain it was a lie designed to hurt, not truth designed to reveal. "So this entire catastrophe started because you cheated," I said. "No," Michael said firmly. "This catastrophe started because Karen chose cruelty over honesty. If she'd confronted me about the affair, if she'd asked for a divorce, if she'd done anything honest, none of this would have happened. She chose to lie in the most devastating way possible, and I chose to respond with violence. We're both responsible." This is where I had to tell Michael something he didn't want to hear. He kept trying to distribute blame, to make this story about two people who'd hurt each other equally. But that's not what happened. Michael had cheated. Karen had responded with a cruel lie. And Michael had responded 2 words with violence that permanently disabled her. These weren't equivalent acts. You can recover from betrayal. You can recover from lies. You can't recover from traumatic brain injury. Michael had escalated emotional harm into physical destruction, and no amount of narrative reshaping could make those things equal. "Do you understand what you're telling me?" I asked. "You're saying that if Karen's memory comes back, you're considering killing her to prevent her from remembering that you pushed her, because she lied about something you caused by cheating in the first place. You're talking about murder to cover up attempted murder, to cover up infidelity. Where does it end?" Michael's face went pale. Hearing it said plainly, without the layers of justification and context he'd wrapped around it, made the progression clear. He'd created a cascade of harm that kept demanding more harm to maintain, and he was standing at a decision point. He could either stop the cycle by confessing everything, or continue it by considering whether his wife needed to die to protect his secret. "I don't know where it ends," he admitted. "That's why I'm here, because I'm terrified of what I'm becoming." The person who pushed Karen, I could almost understand him. He was reacting to impossible information in a moment of shock. But the person I am now, the person who's calculating whether my wife needs to die to protect me, I don't recognize that person, and I don't know how to stop being him. If this story affected you, if it made you think about how violence compounds itself, subscribe for more. There are secrets you haven't heard yet. Here's what I told Michael. The reason his confession destroyed me wasn't because of what he'd done. I've heard worse. I've worked with people who've committed terrible acts. What destroyed me was watching someone build an entire architecture of justification around violence. only to discover the foundation was false, and then immediately start building a new architecture to justify the next potential violence. Michael wasn't learning. He was adapting, getting better at rationalizing harm, and that progression was more terrifying than the original act. "What do you want from therapy?" I asked him directly. "Do you want help stopping yourself from hurting Karen again? Or do you want help living with yourself after you do it?" The question landed hard. Michael sat with it for a long time, and then he said something that made me realize how far gone he was. "I want you to tell me I'm not a monster, that what I did made sense given what Karen told me, that the lie was cruel enough to justify the push. I want permission to be the person I've been for 2 years. And I think that's why your confession destroyed you, isn't it? Because you can't give me that permission. Nobody can." He was right. I couldn't tell him what he'd done was justified, because it wasn't. Karen's lie was cruel, yes. Devastating, absolutely. But it was still just words. And Michael had responded with violence that permanently altered another human being. There's no framework where that becomes equivalent, no justification that makes it acceptable. And the fact that he was already thinking about whether he needed to kill her to maintain his secret meant he'd learned nothing except how to protect himself from consequences. "What happened to Karen wasn't an accident," I said. "But what happens next is a choice. You can confess to the police, face consequences, let your children know the truth about both of you, or you can keep living this lie and see where it takes you. But if you hurt Karen again, if you stop her from remembering the way you're describing, that's not protection. That's not even really murder. That's extermination. That's treating another human being like a problem that needs erasing. And once you cross that line, you don't come back from it." Michael left that session and I never saw him again. 2 weeks later, I read a news article about a woman in Boston who'd died from complications related to a previous brain injury. Karen had developed seizures, the article said, a common complication from traumatic brain injuries. She'd had one while alone in the house and had fallen again. This time, she didn't survive. The article mentioned her grieving husband and 2 young children. It included a quote from Michael about how much he'd loved her, how dedicated he'd been to her care after the first accident, how devastating it was to lose her after fighting so hard to help her recover. I don't know if Michael killed her. I don't know if the seizure was real or if he staged another fall. I'll never know. What I know is that 2 weeks after I told him he was heading toward murder, his wife died in circumstances that could be explained as medical complications. And I have to live with the knowledge that maybe I could have stopped it. Maybe if I'd broken confidentiality, if I'd warned someone, Karen would still be alive. Or maybe the seizure was real and Michael is living with genuine grief and undeserved suspicion. I'll never know which one is true. And here's what this case taught me about human nature, and it's the most disturbing lesson I've learned in 15 years. Violence doesn't exist in isolation. It's always part of a story. And the person committing violence is always the hero of their own story. Michael saw himself as a father protecting his family, as a man responding to intolerable cruelty, as someone forced into impossible choices. He never saw himself as an abuser who'd permanently disabled his wife and possibly killed her, because seeing himself that way would be unbearable. So he constructed narratives, built justifications, created a version of events where he was complicated but ultimately sympathetic. And that's what we all do, isn't it? We're all the heroes of our own stories. We all find ways to justify the harm we cause. We all build narratives where our cruelty was necessary, our violence was defensive, our betrayals were complicated. Michael was just more extreme, but the mechanism was the same. The human ability to rationalize anything if it means protecting our self-image. I think about those two children sometimes, growing up without a mother, living with a father who might be a murderer, never knowing that their entire childhood was built on lies, violence, and death, never knowing that their mother told a cruel lie, that their father responded with attempted murder, that the disability they watched her struggle with was caused intentionally, that her death might not have been the tragedy everyone believed it was. They'll grow up with a sanitized version of events. A mother who had a tragic accident and later died from complications. A father who was devoted and loving and did everything he could. And that lie will be the foundation of their lives. Is that better or worse than the truth? I don't know. Maybe some lies are merciful. Maybe some truths are too destructive to be worth telling. But I know that somewhere in Boston, two children are living with the consequences of their parents' mutual destruction. And they have no idea that the tragedy they're grieving was created deliberately by the people who were supposed to love them most. Michael pushed Karen down the stairs because she told him a lie designed to destroy him. And the reason that confession destroyed me wasn't the violence itself. It was realizing that I couldn't tell him he was wrong. Not completely. Not absolutely. Because Karen had been cruel in a way that was designed to cause maximum psychological harm, and Michael had responded with cruelty that caused maximum physical harm. And in some twisted way, they'd both gotten exactly what they were trying to give each other. Pain so profound it erased everything else. That's what destroyed me. Not that Michael pushed her, but that I understood, just for a second, why he did it. And that understanding felt like a betrayal of everything I believe about harm and responsibility. Because the moment you understand why someone commits violence, you've taken a step toward justifying it. And I never wanted to be someone who could justify pushing a woman down the stairs, no matter what she said. But for 1 second, listening to Michael describe that moment at the top of the stairs, hearing the lie Karen told, understanding the complete destruction it represented, I felt it. That impulse toward violence, that desire to silence something unbearable, and that feeling, that brief recognition of my own capacity for harm. That's what destroyed me, and that wasn't even the darkest confession I've heard. But that's a story for another time.